I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Ines Stepman.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. So today, this has been one of those weeks that, they say decades happen in a week. This has been a busy week, but there are obviously two kind of big umbrellas of things that happened this week. The first was the absolutely catastrophic presidential debate for Joe Biden. And then the second is obviously a slew of very, very important SCOTUS rulings. We're going to focus on the presidential immunity ruling in the Chevron case and the other curbs to the administrative state. But first, we're going to start talking about the debate, and I'll kick it over to Amber.
Thanks. Well, I think you teed it up really well by describing it as catastrophic for Joe Biden. That is definitely not an overstatement of how dismal it was. You had cable news commentators in the immediate aftermath of the debate, including on CNN and MSNBC, near tears, talking about how disastrous it was, how they had finally acknowledged the concerns that voters had about Biden's age and mental acuity. Although I would, obviously suggest that they knew all along and had been gaslighting the American people, along with the White House, which referred to a series of videos just a couple of weeks ago showing Biden freezing up and looking confused as cheap fakes. But I think what's interesting now, a few days out from the debate, is that the Democrats are seemingly starting to get back in line. Joe Biden and his family were at Camp David on Sunday for a swanky photography session with Annie Leibovitz, and they apparently discussed his prospects in terms of staying in the presidential race. And his family, most notably Hunter Biden and his wife Jill, were very insistent that he should not drop out. And they're viewing this in the general context of Biden being underestimated and being the underdog. And this is just more in line with his history of supposedly fighting against people who don't want him to succeed politically. So it looks like, for now at least, Biden is intending to stay in. And with that, you've had Obama, the Clintons, numerous Democratic surrogates, members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi, going on the Sunday shows and talking to Democratic donors to assure them that this was a one-off, that everything is fine, there's nothing to worry about, and also sending out polls that show any of the potential replacements for Biden do not fare as well against former President Donald Trump as the president himself. Even sending out talking points to point out that, hey, it couldn't be that bad because Biden was losing to Trump before the debate and he's still losing to Trump. So really, what's the difference? There's just a panoply of spin coming out of the left right now after what everyone in America saw with their own eyes. But I'm going to kick it over to you guys. Maybe some of you disagree. Maybe you think that they will try to replace Joe Biden. Maybe he will step aside, but it looks like right now they're closing ranks.
Yeah, so I would make a couple comments, and then I'd probably turn that question back around. The first comment being, there's been a lot of talk about, and I think reasonably so, who has been in charge of the country, actually. And we've talked about before, for example, Tablet, David Samuel's sort of profile, making the case that Barack Obama is the one who is really running the country. And that's a theory that I agree with. And you can look no further than the personnel installed in this administration, from Susan Rice originally running domestic policy to the national security and foreign policy apparatus. It is Obamaites everywhere throughout this administration. And when people try to link the fact that you have a president who is mentally unfit to cataclysmic events around the world, that's true. There's a direct line to them. But what I would also say, and something that ought to be hammered home, I think, repeatedly on the merits, is that he has represented faithfully the Obama-Biden agenda. He has fully, adequately represented the Democrat Party slew of policies that lead to disasters from a perspective of peace and prosperity. So he provides a convenient scapegoat and alibi potentially for all of the disastrous things that the policies of the Democrat Party have generated, the consequences they've generated for the country. But even if there was a young, vigorous, intelligent, and articulate commander-in-chief the last 4 years on the Democrat side, the policies and the outcomes would have been exactly the same. And I think that's something that's worth emphasizing. With respect to kind of what I've called Operation Jettison Joe and whether or not it's real, I've always held, and I'm sure I've said on this podcast before, that I've always felt that there's kind of a 2-track strategy here, which is you ride Joe Biden as far as he can take you. But if you need to cut bait with him, there are any number of things you can drop on his head, whether it's, for example, if Merrick Garland wanted to and he had leaked the Robert Hur tapes, and now we know why he covered them up, of course. All the corruption and illegality around the Biden family, the regime has infinite compromise on him. There's no question about it because he's been there for decades. But as long as he's been useful, there's been no reason to try and cut him. But obviously with the polls where they are and with a debate performance where he malfunctioned repeatedly, it raises questions of, can he get the regime across the finish line? The 3 challenges to Operation Jettison Joe, from my perspective, are: 1, can you get him out? And I think you can get him out because when the whole regime comes down, and if Barack Obama himself wanted to, you could force them out no matter how much Dr. Joe Biden wants to drag him into a potential second term. But then Kamala Harris becomes the presumptive nominee. Do they think they have a better chance of winning with her, to the extent you think this is anything resembling a normal election and it's not going to be so riddled with fraud that the Democrats believe that they can win with anyone? So set that aside. Is Kamala Harris the one they really want? And there's a reason beyond being the VP why she ought to be the presumptive nominee. From what I've read, and the Wall Street Journal reported this, she's the only one who Joe Biden can transfer campaign funds to. So are the Democrats going to be able to raise a whole new pot of money for whoever the other replacement would be, Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, et cetera? Lastly, even if it's not Kamala, I mean, even if they figure out who should replace her without completely inflaming the entire Democrat base, then you have the issue of practically the ballots on a state-by-state analysis. It's not at all clear that they're going to be able to get a non-Joe Biden candidate on those ballots. So maybe the Democrats know how to thread the needle and they've gamed this out. There's a timing component here as well about getting through their convention. And then after the convention, if Joe Biden has to step aside for health reasons or whatever else they want to conjure up, then it becomes a simple, the party installs who it wants. Maybe it would be that way with an open convention as well. But these are a lot of different hurdles to overcome. And so while I've always thought Operation Jettison Joe was probable, I don't know if it's the likely outcome here. But given those hurdles I've raised, I'm curious what everyone makes. What you think the odds are of jettisoning Joe versus riding him to the finish line?
So I've always thought that it's unlikely that they will replace him. And as like I've said on here and elsewhere, I've always thought that was unlikely. In part because, but exactly not because I think it's impossible to force him out, for the reasons that Ben said. I mean, I think the people who actually run the country, and I'm the one who brought up that tablet article to this podcast. Like, I definitely think a large part of policy, high level policy, is being made out of Kalorama residency of Obama, a lot of the same people, and they're still listening to Obama. That being said, and we'll get to this in the last segment, most of our government runs itself. The administrative state runs 90% of the functions of government. It doesn't actually need the figurehead president. And this has just made that all the more clear, right? The fact that Joe Biden went out on that debate stage and completely froze in the first 5 minutes of the debate and couldn't finish a sentence shows that at least for large parts of the time, the president is incapacitated and the entire system functions as normal. Now, there are definitely dangers associated with the president being incapacitated, specifically with regard to foreign policy. But actually, I think it just reveals how our government actually functions most of the time, which is that it functions under the rule of mostly unelected bureaucrats who lean basically center left. If you look at FEC data, most federal employees, 95% of donations from federal employees went to Democrats in 2016. So it actually just reveals how our government functions. And that's why, by the way, I think a lot of people get very frustrated. They feel like they vote every 4 years and nothing changes. Yeah, nothing changes because 90% of the government is operating on autopilot with certain assumptions and ideological predispositions built in. And that just became obvious to, I mean, it's impossible to deny at this point that there are at least large parts of the, of the day, maybe outside of the hours of 10 to 4, right? When the elected president is simply not in charge of the American government. So in terms of the debate itself, I think Trump actually did really well. And some of that is getting pushed aside for the obvious headline that Joe is incapacitated. But I thought he did a really good job. Uncharacteristically for him, he restrained himself. It could have looked like somebody beating up on a man who is not in control of his faculties. It did not look that way. Actually, the only time he brought it up was really effective when he said, I don't know what he just said. I'm pretty sure you don't either. That was true. The entire country had no idea what he just said, right? I think he did a really good job restraining himself, actually, which is very unusual for Trump. And then also on his 3 biggest political weaknesses in terms of pulling like normie independents, I thought he gave the 3 best answers he's ever given politically, whether I agree with them or not, different story, but politically. On abortion, he gave a very like sort of moderate answer that flipped the question back the way that it should always be flipped back on media figures who are asking about it, asking that Democrats actually justify their extreme abortion position. On 2020 and January 6th, somewhat related, he simply asked the very basic question. Yeah, on January 6th, the Democrats keep bringing up, the country was better off. Like they're focused on January 6th, but actually, if you think back to your life in January 6th, like you were better off in many ways than you are under Joe Biden. And I thought that was a really good way of handling that question. Anyway, I thought Trump's performance actually is not getting the praise that it should, because the obvious headline is what has happened to Joe. And then finally, my last point that I want to make is about what's happened to Joe. There's a lot of hay being made. Okay, what's happened that the media, as Ben said, is going pretty hard in on Operation Jettison Joe. We've seen some people come back in line in the last couple of days, but the New York Times editorial board came out and said, Joe needs to resign, right? So, and I think there's some of this, there's like a lot of conspiratorial thinking around this. I think it's actually pretty simple. They obviously knew that the president is incapacitated, but dementia takes jumps over time. It's can be quite sudden. Everybody who's seen a grandparent or a loved one go through this, right, knows that can happen. It's not about whether or not he was incapacitated at certain times. People knew that, but they thought, just like his last State of the Union address, for example, that given the right drug cocktail and like sort of the right prompting and the right cover from biased media, they could drag him out enough times during this election where it wouldn't become obvious to the entire country, especially with the way that media was running air cover and calling sort of stray camera moments as cheap fakes or misinformation or whatever else. They thought with that media cover, they would be able to slide by the fact that he is progressively losing his faculties. What we saw in the debate was a step much worse than Joe has been so far. And I think that did take a lot of media members by surprise, not because they didn't know he was fading and potentially incapacitated, but they didn't know how difficult it would be to cover. I think they thought it would be a little bit easier to lie about it, and it wasn't, in a way that I think did startle them. I think that's why you saw the split in the media and some people actually coming out and saying that the game is up.
Yeah. So I think the big 2 buckets, of takeaways. So I'm very white pilled because 1, I don't think they can get rid of him. I'm a little contrary to Ben and Ez here. And 2, I think he can't win now. I think the Republicans are in very good shape. So you're asking what the odds are. I think the odds of him being replaced with the Democratic nominee are less than 5%. And that seems dramatic given how senile he is. But I'm reminded of Ralph Northam. This is a Ralph Northam situation to me, and I think that this is the difference. Ben talked about, the regime can drop all this compromise on his head. It's like, yeah, okay. The entire Democratic Party wanted Ralph Northam to resign after he was caught having put on blackface or a Ku Klux Klan outfit in the alternative. And everybody was sure he was going to resign. If I remember correctly, the predicted numbers said there was only a 25% chance he was going to remain in office beyond like 2 months. They were sure he could be forced to resign. And then people realized, like, wait a second, we can't impeach him. We don't have the numbers to impeach him. The Republicans would have to help us, and they may not. We're not going to do that. And if we don't impeach him, the only option is, well, we gotta make him resign. We have nothing to threaten him with because he's termed out. And it's like, oh, well, then everybody just sort of eventually kind of got in line and realized, well, we can't get rid of him, so we're just going to stop talking about it. And Northam himself realized it's not in my incentive to resign. I don't get anything from resigning. Why would I? I'm not going to. And that was the end of that. I think that's exactly what we're going to see here. All the delegates are Joe's, right? That's the first thing to realize. The primary elections have been run. He owns those delegates. They're his. It would take a massive rule change to fix that. And the only people who could change the rules are Biden appointees, personal friends of the president. So none of them have an incentive to do anything about this other than sort of a general, broad, healthy party incentive. But their personal incentives all point the other way. It's the same thing for his family, all of whom would lose all the trappings of office and the powers that go along with it. Jill Biden doing this Vogue shoot shows how much she's fond of that. Same thing for all his advisors. They all immediately lose their power. Kamala Harris wouldn't keep them. Team Harris and Team Biden don't like each other. Go back all the way to the debates when Kamala Harris called Joe Biden a racist. I mean, she was picked for DEI reasons. They don't like each other. Nobody in the Biden family or close circle has any love for Kamala Harris or any respect for her as a politician. So I think the odds are very low that they'll be replaced. And then, so that's part one. Part two is, I don't think that they have a chance anymore, because I read a very good article that described what happened. The difference between private and public knowledge. Everybody privately knew that Joe Biden was senile, but it wasn't like it wasn't an emperor had no clothes moment. The debate was the emperor has no clothes moment. He revealed himself to the entire world as being obviously and clearly senile in a way that nobody could deny anymore. And so it's sort of like the Harvey Weinstein thing. Everybody privately knew that Harvey Weinstein was a rapist, but it wasn't public knowledge in the same way. Not only does everybody know, but you know that everybody else knows too. So that changes the dynamic in a way that means it's terrible for Joe Biden. He can no longer give an unscripted speech the remainder of the campaign. He's already taking a beating. I just saw a CNN poll come out that shows him down 6 nationally. That's devastating because Trump has an advantage of the Electoral College. So I think we're going to win. I don't think Biden can recover from this. And I think, just from a personal perspective, I think obviously the 25th Amendment should be invoked because it's not safe to have a president who's senile and can't think straight. So, but they're not going to do that either. I would bet on people to act in their personal incentives, which means there's no incentive for Biden to leave. So he's not and he's going to get beat.
I'd love to jump off that 25th Amendment point as well, Will, because there are two attacks that Republicans can employ against the Democrats if they do decide to replace Biden. And one is obviously that if Biden is not well enough to finish out the campaign or even serve another 4 years in office, then he's obviously not well enough to be president right now. So if you think that you need to remove him from the democratic process, from the re-election campaign, then you also have to, in order to be consistent, which of course Democrats aren't, but this is just what the political talking point would be, is that you have to invoke the 25th Amendment and remove him from office. And then how can the party that is so insistent that Trump is this grave threat to democracy combat that man by taking away the votes of primary voters in the delegates that are already assigned to this specific candidate? So I think those would be the two sort of political arguments against the Democrats for removing Biden. But I wanted to get just a little bit more into Dr. Jill Biden, because she is obviously a very important confidant to Joe, and someone who is very much standing between Joe and Democrats who might want to get him out of the re-election campaign. Will mentioned the Vogue cover that came out with perhaps the worst possible timing, just a few days after the debate, where Jill is wearing this $10,000+ Ralph Lauren coat. And the first part of the piece is an editor's note where they had called Jill and got her first reaction to Joe's debate performance, where of course she describes it as, 90 minutes is not illustrative of his entire political career or his past 4 years in office. But then immediately following that, the first paragraph in the Vogue profile talks about the allure of power and how it feels to ride in a motorcade where the highways are entirely shut down and you see cars on both sides of you completely at a standstill, and you get to be that person who is who the world stands still for. To have that contrasted with her downplaying her husband's obvious senility, I think just really demonstrates how craven this woman is, how obsessed she is with the idea of being first lady, of having access to power, of having the ability to access the wealth that the Biden family has generated through Joe's political positions. There's an Axios report from Alex Thompson that talks about how Jill was one of the main characters who shielded Joe from anyone in the White House outside of extremely high-level staffers and close advisors, because she knew that she had to keep a lid on what was happening to her husband in order to stay in power. And of course, there is this moment immediately following the debate where she comes out to introduce the president and says to him, like he's one of her pre-K students, you did a great job, Joe. You answered all of the questions. We're so proud of you. It was such a mask off moment for Jill. And if she had any goodwill, I think with suburban female voters, a lot of that evaporated, because I think a lot of women who are married see this and realize that she is doing a huge disservice to her husband.
I would echo. I thought the profile was disgusting, but it tells you everything you need to know about the Bidens. And just to put maybe segue us to some extent, I set aside the whatever the probabilities are on Operation Jettison Joe. I think clearly the odds are stacked against jettisoning him, just for all of the different hurdles discussed. And I think Will's point is an interesting one about the Northam comparison. I've maintained that the media feeding frenzy part of this, that the Joe Biden camp had an advantage of the July 4th lull potentially coming up, and then also sentencing for Donald Trump just a week later. However, right before we came to record today, we know that based upon building on the arguments in the immunity case, or the opinion in the immunity case, which we'll discuss momentarily, that Trump is challenging the New York ruling, and that may well now delay sentencing, because the Alvin Bragg's office has come out saying that New York would not fight the challenge that the Trump camp is going to bring there. So perhaps then we will not have sentencing before the Republican convention. It's also interesting reading the political tea leaves. How is Merchan going to navigate all of the timing around sentencing and such? And what would it have done had there been Donald Trump sent to Rikers Island on July 11th? Would that inflame and provoke the country and backfire on the Joe Biden camp? Would they potentially try and leverage and exploit that to say, see, MAGA equals terrorist? But potentially now that may be a headline that is off the table if sentencing is going to be pushed back.
Okay, so moving on. Next is my topic, which is the presidential immunity case. The Supreme Court ruled yesterday morning that the president on the Trump versus United States case, the case out of DC, that presidents do indeed have immunity from prosecution for their official acts. They have absolute immunity for those powers, for the use of their powers that are explicitly granted by the Constitution, things like the pardon power. And then they have presumptive immunity for anything within the outer bounds of their responsibility that parrots language from Nixon v. Fitzgerald, the case that found that presidents are civilly immune from prosecution for their official acts. This is not a surprising ruling if you were either paying attention to the briefing or the oral argument. The pretty clearly at oral argument, the judges were extremely skeptical, at least the 6 conservative judges were extremely skeptical of the position of the government that set, and actually forced Michael Dreeben, who is the advocate for DOJ, to basically admit that the DC Circuit got it wrong. The DC Circuit and the lower court had found that there was no immunity at all whatsoever, no from criminal prosecution for former presidents. And I mean, Gorsuch and Roberts basically forced him to admit that obviously there is some amount of immunity, whether you characterize it as something like a public authority exception or whatever you do to just, to say why a president can't be prosecuted for, military action overseas. Whatever that is, it's obviously a form of immunity. And so the judges found there was immunity. It wasn't a complete win for Team Trump. They wanted to say that they wanted the court to say that presidents are immune for official acts, save those for which the president is impeached and convicted for. That's not how far the court went. They just simply said there's presumptive immunity for official acts, and that the presumption can be overcome if a prosecutor can demonstrate that prosecuting a president under that statute for those acts would not impede the functioning of the executive branch. That's a reasonable, that's an exception. It's pretty underdeveloped, but the long story short here is this case is going to get kicked back to the lower court for a hearing on whether the acts in the indictment were official acts, and then whether or not they are entitled to the immunity that the court outlined. Bottom line, no trial for another, no trial this year, probably no trial for 2 years, even assuming, God forbid, that President Trump loses and the Biden administration continues this. But a big victory for President Trump, but also kind of obvious and an indication of how silly the district court and the DC Circuit were. And with that, I'm curious what you guys think about this opinion and where you think things are going to go.
I would call this one of two rulings that were posed massive blows to really the basic credibility of the Biden Justice Department at the end of the day, because before the immunity ruling, we had the Fisher case, which was on the Justice Department's torturing of a Sarbanes-Oxley related obstruction of an official proceeding statute to claim that J6ers were obstructing an official proceeding when the obstruction was really about destroying documents, hiding documents, conduct like that. And they used it to hang it around the necks of J6ers and potentially subject political opposition, political activists, protesters on a whole slew of issues to up to 20 years in prison. The Supreme Court smacked down that reading of obstruction official proceeding. And 2 of the 4 charges in this January 6th case were conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding and obstruction of an official proceeding. So back to back, you had rulings that dramatically challenge the zealousness of the Biden DOJ and special counsel Jack Smith, who has been smacked down unanimously by the Supreme Court before, for that matter. So to me, that's the positive of what Supreme Court did. Now, I still am a little bit hesitant to call this like an unqualified victory, because while in my reading of the majority opinion, at least, the justices are saying, essentially you have presumptive immunity in these areas and some grounds that were bases for the indictment go away under this ruling. Others go back to Judge Chutkan. Do I trust that Judge Chutkan is going to have the same view the Supreme Court might have ultimately when she goes through her analysis and both sides make their arguments? I'm not sure. Of course, all of this, to some extent may be mooted by whatever happens in the election and then what happens to this case and how it's disposed of at the end of the day. So I call it, this is certainly a victory for the Trump side and a massive loss for the DOJ. And compounding that loss, I will say, I focused on Justice Thomas's concurrence. Now, Justice Thomas stood alone in his concurrence, which is probably illustrative of where the court is. But he basically clapped back at those who talk about no one is above the law. And that was sort of the Democrat talking point around this case about trying to challenge Donald Trump's presidential authority. And he basically said, Justice Thomas essentially said, well, hold on here. Merrick Garland and Jack Smith aren't above the law either, yet there are serious deficiencies potentially in not only special counsel Jack Smith's office, but whether he was even lawfully appointed to that office. And Justice Thomas goes through the appointments clause and basically explains that there's no specific statute that Merrick Garland pointed to establish special counsel Smith's office. Smith is not a presidential appointee. He wasn't appointed and then didn't go through a vote before the Senate. And so it's not clear, based upon the provisions that Merrick Garland pointed to in appointing Jack Smith, that he could be lawfully appointed to that position. This is a clarion call, I think, for dealing with a basic fundamental question about the legitimacy of the prosecutor and the prosecution itself. We'll see if Judge Cannon will take this up and take seriously the arguments that Justice Clarence Thomas raised. But all around, I think this is a more than needed rebuke of an out of control Justice Department. And it's just a shame that it had to reach the Supreme Court to get there.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Thomas's concurrence here. And actually some of the things that he said, not just about the specific way the special counsel was appointed, but with the Office of Special Counsel generally, we have accepted over time, especially since the Clinton administration, this like position without actually thinking about it, in the same way that we don't think correctly about accountability for the Justice Department itself. Ultimately, the accountability for the Justice Department runs through the elected president, right? Otherwise, you are giving bureaucrats with guns completely, you are giving them power without any kind of small d democratic oversight. That's what it actually is. It would be as if the local police department did not answer to the mayor, did not answer to the voters of the town, right? That's what we're talking about here. And yes, we want a certain amount of operational independence of the Justice Department. We don't want the president interfering with like every single prosecutorial decision that the DOJ does. But ultimately, the direction of the Justice Department is directed by the president. That's the point. And in absence of that, you have a totally unaccountable branch of law enforcement, which, you know, it's funny because the left is all about defunding the police or whatever, like crazy view of the actual police in this country, and pretends that they're unaccountable. But every police department on the municipal level, right, is actually accountable to elected officials. So I think we think about this all backwards. I just want to back up for 1 second and say the general idea of presidential immunity is the only option that actually makes sense on a common sense level. There's no way that any person holding the office of the president should be able to be in a personal capacity sued for decisions that he makes as president after he leaves office, right? Leaving aside the particularities of the Trump case, that is an unworkable idea, right? So somebody believes, for example, that some action of the president is unconstitutional. The example I've seen floating around online with a very bad interpretation, or stupid interpretation, frankly, from lawyers on the left has been, oh, you know, Biden instituted this program, loan forgiveness program, that it was declared unconstitutional. Okay, so he unconstitutionally used his power to forgive student loans. Okay, the remedy for that is that the policy gets reversed. Not that we can then sue Joe Biden and try to send him to jail for the actions that he took as president, which is really the position that the left is taking in this case. Of course, presidents need that kind of immunity. Politics itself would be impossible. The accountability for political actors is politics, right? For the decisions that the president makes in his official capacity is politics. It's impeachment. It's elections, right? Not sending him to jail under lawfare. So the basics of this case, like just aside from the details of the law, there is, I don't think there is an example of any other country in which the presidents, and no, at least not in the first world, where the presidents are don't have some kind of broad immunity for the kinds of decisions that they make in office. It's just not a workable standard. So
Yeah,
acting like it's shocking is ridiculous.
Yeah, I know we're running a bit short on time here, but I'll just bring up two interesting counterpoints to the left from people who are not fans of Trump, to say the least. Attorney General Bill Barr has come out and described the dissenting opinion in this case from Sotomayor, where they sort of daydreamed about Trump using SEAL Team 6 to assassinate Biden and how he would have immunity for that. And he described this as a horror story that makes no sense. Obviously, assassinating a political opponent would not be an official act of the presidency and would not be under his authority. And then on MSNBC, Chuck Rosenberg, who actually resigned from the DEA during the Trump administration because he took issue with a lot of the comments he made about the judicial system, went on MSNBC and described this as logical. And as Inez just said, really the only system that makes sense, so that you don't have just a train of presidents prosecuting the prior president for things that he did while in office. So I would just point to those two individuals as helpful counters to a lot of the fear mongering that's been coming out of the left legal space in response to this decision.
Yeah, I mean, Sotomayor's dissent here is hysterical. There's no other word for it. But also, like, it's funny because all of the left hysteria is around, oh, we're like implementing dictatorial powers in the presidency. You don't think it's an inducement to stay in office past your term if you can be sued for every official action you've been taken in a personal capacity? You don't think that's an inducement for presidents to stay on longer than their term? I mean, that is an inducement to the kind of dictatorial powers and dictatorial staying over past your term, in my view.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Inez, your topic's up next. Let's talk Chevron. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think this has been just an amazing week in terms of having, a little bit less depression than we normally do on the right about the future of the country. To my mind, this is the most important case the Supreme Court has decided, this current Supreme Court has decided. And I think a lot of both sides are maybe either not getting it wrong, but are focused on sort of the wrong thing. We hear a lot about this case being a curtail on regulatory power of the agencies. Now, the marching orders went out a day after Loper Bright. Every single mainstream media headline basically had the phrase victory for business interests, right? That's how they decided to frame this case about regulatory power, about agency power, and about the interpretation of law and statutes. So, and then on the flip side, you see a lot of the sort of usual suspects of the establishment right excited about the regulatory curbing that this case will grant, which is all true. Like, that's true that it's going to curb certain types of regulatory power. Now, those specific types of regulatory power it's going to curb are when agencies are interpreting their enabling statutes, the statutes that give them the power to regulate and to, sort of fill in the details of what Congress passes, right? When they're interpreting their own enabling statutes, they're not entitled to deference. Courts are actually experts in reading and interpreting ambiguous statutes, right? Not quote unquote the expert class in agencies. This is a matter of law, not a matter of how many units of a particular pollutant can be in X numbers of gallon of water. This is about reading the law and interpreting it. And courts since the 80s have been totally illegitimately ceding their basic power in reading statutes, particularly ambiguous statutes, and ceding that to the administrative state. So yes, this will affect their ability to regulate, but more deeply, this is a sea change in the way that our government has operated really for the last, especially since Chevron in the 80s, but it's a train that started a century ago. And the question really is, how much power should unelected agencies have in terms of essentially keeping the country running? We were talking about this in the first segment, right? How much power should be granted to these 2.8 million civilian bureaucrats who make policy, who make functionally law when they're not supposed to? And one very obvious example of that we talked about in the last few weeks is the fact that the Department of Education issues regulations that read the word sex in our civil rights statutes to include gender identity. That's not within the power of regulatory agencies to make up new invented definitions of words that vastly expand their own power and the scope of the law that they're implementing. That's the sort of thing that is not entitled to deference from the courts. The courts should just read the law. In this case, they should just read the law and say, well, the original public meaning of sex when when Title IX was passed in 1972 did not include, people who have fantasies about being the other sex. Right. So that really is what we're talking about here. I think this goes far beyond regulatory, regulating businesses or whatever else. I think it is going to be filled in over time by courts, but I think this is a really important sea change in the basic structure of our governance, which has shifted more and more towards an unaccountable technocracy and away from democratic control. So I think this is a big deal. I think this decision is a big deal. And just to put a bow on it before I kick it out, the additional fun part about this is because this case is about the APA, this is about, administrative procedure, it's about, sort of nitty-gritty issues of the law. The smart people on the left know how important this is, which is why they freaked out about it. But it's really hard for them to explain or whip up the people who like march in the streets. Their sort of street arm of the Democratic Party into a frenzy over this case because it is so technical. So it's fun to be on the opposite side of that for once. Sometimes talking about important issues or like balancing of powers on the right can often feel very disconnected from the way that ordinary people who don't follow politics and law day in, day out think. Now the left is on that side of the debate where they're having to explain to people very technical things in order to defend basically unaccountable technocracy and rule by experts, which is kind of a fun place to see the left, in my opinion. And so do you think this case is important, I guess, are the questions for the group? Because there has been some pushback on the right about the importance of this case, especially actually in our circles. And then just the left's reaction and how you think this will affect the balance of power going forward.
Yeah, it's weird. I don't know how much impact it will have because I'm not like some administrative law expert who understands how the path of the law will really change. Just seems obvious to me that agencies shouldn't be trusted to interpret statutes that limit their authority or explain what their authority is. That's like, you can't, there's an obvious like problem there, fox guarding the henhouse, that sort of thing. In terms of its actual impact, I don't know. I mean, even without Chevron, I think you'd still see a world where the courts were being a lot more skeptical of agency authority. So that would be my sort of intuition. But I mean, it's a good thing. The administrative state's taken a lot of L's lately. That's good. The administrative state, I'm one of the big believers in, okay, we should be looking to wield government power a little more, but that's a long-term challenge. And in the short term, like the administrative state is going to be staffed up by Democrats, so weakening them's got to be good.
I interviewed Megan Lapp, who's one of the fisherwomen with Relentless, plaintiff in Relentless. And it was really fascinating to hear her explanation of the regulatory statute that was in play here, because it was such an amazing reminder of how these so-called administrative experts are obviously anything but. I mean, just anecdotally, I have a close friend of mine who works in the Department of Agriculture who has never stepped foot on a farm in his entire life. And yet he is in charge of course, implementing all of these rules related to legislation that Congress has passed simply because he happens to hold a title that would render him an expert. But in Loper Bright and Relentless, not only were these fisher people required to have basically regulatory advisors on their boats who had no experience fishing. Like these were people who were basically 20 to 25-year-old kids who were doing this because they could make a decent paycheck and have a stable income. And it didn't require much training for them to do it. It was like, I think a couple days or a week-long training program. They'd throw them on the fisher boats, and then they would be in charge of basically monitoring the catch to determine whether or not these people were overfishing. And keep in mind, these fisher people had been doing this for generations. Like their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents were all owning these boats and these ships and fishing in these waters for hundreds of years. But they had to defer to a 22-year-old on their boat because the government said that they had to have them on there. But in addition to all of that, these fisher people had to pay the salary of the individual who was telling them that they might be overfishing without any possible experience. So it was just like the worst excess of the regulatory state working to try to decimate the commercial fishing industry. And so I think it was such a wonderful sort of David versus Goliath story that ultimately led to Chevron being overturned.
I think it's an amazing commentary that it is perceived as something revolutionary that judges should be the ones adjudicating about ambiguous statutes, not letting unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats make the determination and giving them the presumption of expertise on how to read law. But by the same token, the fact that this was the precedent that prevailed for decades does show you that this is a significant blow, I think, substantively and symbolically. This is one of a series of decisions where this court has clipped the wings of the administrative state. It's worth noting the last day of the term as well, there was a case that said, as I read it, that those who are impacted by regulations under the APA can bring suit outside a normal 6-year statutes of limitation. So after there's a final agency action. In addition, I thought the Jarkissi case, if you haven't read Justice Gorsuch's concurrence there, and I think he is joined by Justices Thomas and Alito, he goes through chapter and verse, basically the tyranny of being put before an administrative law judge in an administrative state court. And that case, Jarkissi dealt with whether one, if the SEC, for example, brings action against you, if you have the right to trial by jury, or if you have to go in front of an SEC judge and court. And this really is tyranny, administrative state courts, as a layman, as best as I can see it. You have to go up against the agency that's challenging you, or that you're challenging, literally on their home turf, in front of a judge that's going to be deferential to them. And it's essentially the administrative state playing judge, jury, and executioner. And the court found, reasonably so, but again, I guess revolutionarily so in some ways, that you have a right to trial by jury. You don't have to go up against an administrative state judge. And Gorsuch's opinion, I just think, is a masterful elucidation of how tyrannical this regime is. I'm obviously critical of the court on a whole slew of other issues. And in my parting shots, I'll be critical of the court on one other case from this term. But when it comes to the administrative state, this is one of the few places where I do think we can safely say it really is a conservative majority here. And that's undeniably a good thing for the country.
Yeah, I only want to add to what Ben said about tyranny. Administrative law, the entirety of administrative law, is a replacement for the constitutional system, for constitutional rights that Americans assume that they have before they walk in to an administrative law court. Judge, jury, and executioner is the quote unquote expert. So Ben is right. This is a tyrannical form of government. And I'm also very glad that the court is doing a good job, at least on this fundamental question.
All right, with that, final thoughts. My final thoughts are on the United Kingdom, because I mean, obviously, there's been so much American news. We haven't really been talking about what's happening abroad, but there were actually United Kingdom and France. Well, I'll not throw both of them in there. France just held a general election. The National Rally, the right wing party led by Marine Le Pen, won pretty big. I don't actually know a lot of detail. I mean, the French parliamentary elections seem actually kind of complicated with 2 phases, and it's not clear to me how they elect representatives, but the strength of her party is something to see. Apparently, Bardella apparently would be the prime minister. And then in particular, I've been focused on the United Kingdom, because what's happening in the United Kingdom is its own interest. I mean, the outcome in that general election, which is in 2 days, is not really in doubt. And it's not a good one. Labour's going to win under the guy, Keir Starmer. But the really interesting thing that's happening there is we might see the death of the Conservative Party to Nigel Farage's Reform UK. Recent polling I've seen shows that Reform UK is actually ahead of the Conservatives, which would be remarkable in that system. That's not proportional representation. That's first past the post. And there's apparently the potential for a total wipeout of the Conservatives. I wouldn't bet against Nigel Farage. I mean, remember back in 2019, he won something like 30% of the vote when the Conservatives only got 7%. And boy, do the Conservatives desert it, because I mean, we call them the Conservatives, but that is not a conservative party, not anymore. That is a neoliberal, centrist party that has wildly expanded immigration. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think, the question is whether or not reform is actually going to be able to get real seats, or is it just going to be an evisceration of the right, and what the consequences would be in Britain. But the Conservative Party's just been so terrible for so long that I'm kind of hoping to see them take a real beating and basically have to ultimately let Nigel Farage take over the rump of the party. So that's what I'm hoping for there.
My final thoughts are on Steve Bannon reporting to prison this week. He was held in contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with a subpoena from the January 6th Select Committee, citing presidential immunity. This is the same sort of scenario that landed Peter Navarro in prison. He's about 3 months into his 4-month sentence. Bannon will also serve a 4-month sentence. And Peter Navarro was the first government official, I believe, to actually be jailed for refusing a congressional subpoena. Steve Bannon was supposed to speak at NatCon. Alas, he will not be there, and will record for it instead. So definitely check that out. But he gave a final interview before he went into the pen and talked about how he views himself as a political prisoner, and he has no regrets about the way that he handled the subpoena from the January 6th Select Committee. Whatever you think about Steve Bannon or Peter Navarro, I think they're both heroes for the way that they have refused to comply with an obviously sham partisan political committee, and citing their justified presidential immunity and choosing to accept the consequences to show the injustice that has occurred here.
Yeah, my final thought is I testified in front of the House Oversight Committee last week, and not that that in itself is so important, but the subject of the hearing was Title VII, and particularly the lack of enforcement of Title VII deals with workplace discrimination on, for example, on the basis of race and sex. The lack of enforcement when companies, particularly in 2020, the height of the BLM movement, came out and announced the kind of racial quotas that even university departments, even before the Students for Fair Admissions case, were not allowed to use, right? It wasn't actually legal for universities to set hard racial quotas. So that's why they, evaded doing that and did it in other ways, right? And then here you have companies like Google and Goldman Sachs coming out and saying publicly to the press, we're going to have 30% of our workforce be Black or Latino by 2025. Those kind of hard racial quotas were never legal in the workforce, but the enforcement of the EEOC, which is the agency tasked with the sort of first line of defense, enforcement of Title VII, we're ignoring, because of course that was discrimination against white people, which is all well and good. So the fact that Republicans are interested in holding a hearing about this issue, I think actually does show that the Overton window is opening up on issues surrounding the Civil Rights Act. I also testified to the EEOC has put out a similar guidance as the Department of Education, where within the workplace, they have reinterpreted sex to mean gender identity. This is terrible because it has consequences for women. For example, one woman contacted our law center at Independent Women's Law Center. She has to shower at work because she works with chemicals, right? So after working with dangerous chemicals, like, the women have to go and shower, the men have to go and shower. Now there's a guy who claims that he's a woman and he's in the showers with the women, and somehow this agency, which is hysterically over-enforcing and traditionally hysterically over-enforced sexual harassment laws, where a stray joke or a picture on someone's desk, right, amounts to sexual harassment at work, which has really driven a lot of the crackdown on of employers on speech policing and sort of being really worried about any kind of potentially offensive anything at work. Even in that environment, we see the flip side, where the EEOC is actually encouraging a man to repeatedly show his coworkers his penis as a matter of civil rights law. So it's just it's crazy enforcement. But I think the fact that the Republican majority in the House actually considers this an issue and is willing to hold hearings on it is an improvement in the Overton window, and opens a much needed discussion around both the enforcement of civil rights law and what reforms might be necessary to civil rights law to actually achieve, for example, in this case, a colorblind workplace. So yeah, you can check that out if you want to. The hearing is on the House Oversight website.
I will, as promised, start negative, but I'll end on an uplifting note. So the negative will be the least favorite opinion from my vantage point of the court this term in Murthy v. Missouri, which I anticipated walking out of oral arguments, and arguably the court wasn't as terrible as it could have been in this ruling, but nevertheless, incredibly depressing. So as we've discussed myriad times, Murthy v. Missouri was sort of the premier violation of the First Amendment by proxy case to be brought, a challenge to the public-private mass censorship regime that started out with the censoring of the Hunter Biden story, extended to anything and everything associated with election integrity and outcomes, then expanded to COVIDian orthodoxy and beyond. And at the lower court levels, there were judges, federal judges, who recognized that the feds can't coerce, cajole, collude with, otherwise encourage social media companies to censor speech that the regime doesn't like. And they imposed a preliminary injunction freezing that speech policing during the pendency of the case. The oral argument questions and arguments that were raised were disappointing, to say the least, and in my view reflected that the court really had no sense as to the facts in the record. And the majority opinion by Justice Barrett, I think, illustrated that as well. The court did not even rule on the merits of the case. They said that the plaintiffs lack standing, and they created a standard basically that makes it so that it's unclear if anyone would have standing to bring a case against the federal government for colluding with the social media companies to censor speech. They used a quote unquote traceability standard that would be almost impossible to touch. And so they didn't even touch on the merits of the case. And so in practice, the case gets remanded back down to the district court. And the only way really for the case to proceed will be for the plaintiffs to seek out more discovery and to make their case a better case, apparently, that they do actually have standing here. So as a practical matter, this means that the censorship regime can do just what it did in 2020 in 2024, except probably in a far more sophisticated fashion, more surreptitiously, with the benefit of knowing what plaintiffs might do to challenge the conduct on the back end. And of course, the 2024 election is going to proceed and the censorship regime will be operative. Justice Alito wrote a blistering dissent here, just as he had dissented when the court originally stayed the preliminary injunction, freezing the freeze on speech policing while the Supreme Court took up the case. Alito's dissent is more than worth your time. And he basically says we may well come to rue the fact that the court wouldn't rule on one of the most consequential free speech cases probably in the history of the republic. If you were going to look for a silver lining, you could say the court did not rule on the merits. So we still don't know what the court's perspective is on when censorship by proxy that violates our First Amendment rights actually occur. But in this case, from my vantage point, not to speak is to speak. If it wasn't going to be this case, it's not clear to me what the case will be where the Supreme Court will rule on the merits. And it's not at all clear that the court will rule in favor of the free speech side on the merits. And clearly they didn't hear, because by saying the plaintiffs lack standing to bring the preliminary injunction, the injunction is gone. And we're going to have to live with consequences of that in 2024 and perhaps beyond as well. Now, on an uplifting note, beyond the positive rulings that we can talk about during this term, we are about to celebrate July 4th, and always worth rereading, in my view, the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, as well as some of the commemorative addresses, thinking, for example, of the 150th anniversary address, well worth your time. If you look at what the long train of abuses and usurpations look like, I'm sure things looked pretty bleak from the perspective of the founders then as well, but they overcame the tyranny, the despotism that they faced, and ultimately triumphed. So if there's one positive to take there, we should all look to the words of those founders and be inspired by them. And hopefully that rekindles within all of us the fire to continue fighting the good fight against incredibly long odds and in a time where political opponents are being locked up by this regime.
Okay, with that, on behalf of Amber, Ben, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain. See you at the next NatCon Squad.